Okay, diminished seventh chords. This is a pretty fun one. It's fairly straightforward, honestly, in terms of the basic concepts, which I talked about in the main video. But there's actually quite a bit of extra detail that is important to know here outside of the main concept. So I'm going to run down a list of things that I will talk about today in this video now, so you can get an idea if this is something you want to stick around and watch. So the first thing is I'm going to talk about the structure of these chords more. And then I'm going to quickly recap what I talked about in the main video just to make sure we all are on the same page here with the main idea. And then we'll talk about how these chords relate to secondary dominant chords. We'll talk about chaining multiple diminished seventh chords together. Then we'll get into deceptive resolutions of diminished seventh chords. And then finally, melody. We'll talk about how to know exactly which notes to use in a melody on top of a chord progression that uses diminished seventh chords. So lots of cool stuff here. Unfortunately, didn't get to fit this in the video, but it will be very useful to know. So let's get into it. So first of all, the structure of a diminished seventh chord is obviously very precise, as the structure of any chord is, but there's a couple of other chords that you could easily confuse with the diminished seventh chord. So I want to clarify this and talk more about how the structure affects the function of the chord. So first of all, here are three different diminished type chords, and they're all different. So the first one is the diminished triad, and the chord symbol is usually just this little. So it's the root of the chord, and then they put the degrees symbol, small circle. That means diminished. So if there's no 7 or anything like that, this is just a triad, which is a 3-note chord. So we're going to build it off of C. So it would be, let me start down here, C, E flat, and G flat in this case. That's C diminished. So the structure of this is we start with the root note, then we have a minor third, or a flat 3, and then we have a diminished fifth, or a flat 5. So in other words, it's a minor third, and then another minor third up from that to give you the diminished fifth. So that's the diminished triad. So not a seventh chord, but a triad. Now, both of these chords are seventh chords, meaning they have one more note stacked a third above the fifth of the chord. And they all use, both of these chords use the diminished triad as the basis. So these are both just diminished triads with some type of seventh added on top. So if we take C diminished again as the foundation of this chord, C, E flat, G flat, then again, we're just going to put a seventh on top of this. So let me do it both times here. C diminished, C, E flat, G flat. Okay, so this chord is the chord that we have in the video. This is the actual chord we're talking about today. Fully diminished seventh chord, also known as diminished seventh chord. Now, I'm stressing the fully part because this chord is called half diminished, or half diminished seventh chord. So I'll talk about that one in just a second. But this one is the fully diminished seventh chord. So what it is it's a diminished triad again, and then it has a seventh, but the seventh is specifically a diminished seventh. So that's why we call it fully diminished. It's a diminished triad plus a diminished seventh. So everything is diminished. It's fully diminished. Okay, so a diminished seventh is the interval of 9 half steps. So we're talking about 9 half steps above the root. So that means, so if you think about a normal seventh, normally sevenths are either major sevenths or minor sevenths. So you can think of a major seventh as like a half step smaller than an octave above the root. So here's C, the octave would be C, of course. So a half step below that would be B natural. That's a major seventh. And then a minor seventh would be a half step smaller than that. So if I make that B flat, that's a minor seventh. That's 10 half steps. Now if I make that flat again, so B double flat, now that's 9 half steps. That's actually a diminished seventh. So a diminished seventh is 2 half steps smaller than a major seventh, or a half step smaller than a minor seventh. So here's a fully diminished seventh chord. Again, diminished triad plus a diminished seventh. So it sounds very dark and dissonant. Actually, let me play this triad first. So here's C diminished as a triad. Root minor third diminished fifth. So that's already dark and dissonant. a big part of the dissonance there is the interval between the root and the diminished fifth. That's the tritone, which I talked about in my last video on substitute dominance. The tritone is just a very inherently unstable sound. It wants to resolve somewhere. Yeah, and it can resolve in a bunch of different ways, actually. But the tritone is the basis for the whole idea here of the diminished seventh chord being unstable sounding. So in the fully diminished seventh chord, there's our diminished triad plus now our diminished seventh, which would be B double flat, which is the same sounding note as A natural, just spelled as a seventh, so it's B double flat. So now we have two tritones, actually. There's a tritone between the root and the diminished fifth, and between the minor third and the diminished seventh. So it's even more dissonant now. We have this really, really tense sound. It's also very dark sounding because it's all minor thirds. So if you start on the root note, you go up a minor third, and up a minor third from there, then up a minor third from there. That gives you the diminished seventh chord. And this is really dark sounding because minor thirds are like, they sound minor, they sound dark, they sound somber. So if you have a chord that is made up entirely of minor thirds, then of course that's going to be a really dark, unstable chord. Okay, so that's the fully diminished seventh chord. Now I mentioned this chord because it's called half diminished, which is very easy to confuse this chord with the fully diminished seventh chord. So we're not talking about this chord today. This is a totally different chord. Half diminished means, so remember the fully diminished seventh chord was a diminished triad with a diminished seventh. So everything is diminished. But half diminished, not everything is diminished. So we have the diminished triad, but then we have a minor seventh. So instead of a diminished seventh, we have a minor seventh. So it sounds less tense. It's still certainly tense, but it sounds like this. It's not quite as tense as if I have that diminished seventh in there. So here's minor 7 flat 5, which is another name for half diminished. So C half diminished, C fully diminished. So one of them has a kind of stronger expectation to it, and that's the one we're talking about today, the fully diminished seventh chord. So I just mentioned minor 7 flat 5. That's just another name for half diminished. So C half diminished, C minor 7 flat 5, both the exact same chord, just two different names. This is the name we use more in contemporary and jazz theory. This is more what you see in classical theory. So this symbol, by the way, the circle means diminished, like I said. So when you cut it in half by drawing a diagonal line through it, that means half diminished. So cutting that circle in half. So for diminished seventh chords, for fully diminished seventh chords, we can write C little circle 7 for C diminished 7, or you can write DIM 7. Again, these mean the exact same thing, just two different styles of notation. Okay, so there is something interesting about the structure here. Last part of this section here is, which is that the fact that this chord is built in all minor thirds means that actually if we continue doing minor thirds just forever, this chord is going to repeat onto itself. So let me show you what I mean. So in this case, we're starting on C. So we go up a minor third, up a minor third, up a minor third. That gives us our C diminished seventh chord. And now if I go up another minor third from there, I actually land on C again. So it just kind of takes me back to my home note, my root note here. So then I can keep, I can keep doing that, just continually going up in minor thirds as long as I want. And this chord is just going to keep looping back onto itself. It's almost like playing a scale, You can just keep going and play another octave of the scale by following the same pattern, and you can do that infinitely. But these chords are symmetrical, just like playing a scale. So what this means is, actually, we can use this information to extrapolate that there are only really 3 different diminished seventh chords that exist. So if I have, say, okay, C, E flat, G flat, B double flat, and I go up another minor third to get a C again, well, what if I just let go of this C on the bottom here and I have E flat as my root note now? So now I'm going E flat, G, B double flat, and I guess this would be D double flat. Well, these are the exact same 4 pitch classes that I just had in C diminished 7, but now it's sounding like an E flat chord, E flat diminished 7. So let me show this on paper. It might make more sense. So here's C diminished 7. If I go up another minor third, I could get C again. So now if I get rid of this C down here, now I have a 4-note chord. It's a diminished 7th chord because it's minor third, minor third, minor third, but it's starting on E flat now. But I didn't actually change any of the notes. This is still the same exact notes that are in C diminished 7. So what I'm getting at here is that because these chords are symmetrical, any one of the chord tones could actually be the root of the chord, and it would not change any of the notes. So if I change the root to E flat here, I have the same 4 notes. If I change the root to G flat, I still have the same 4 notes, because look, here's G flat diminished 7, G flat, B double flat, D double flat, which is the same thing as C. And then, let's see, I would have F double flat, which is the same thing as, oh wait, no, I'm sorry, that would just be, yeah, it would be F double flat. These spellings get really confusing, you know, a really weird thing here. But F double flat is the same thing as E flat. So I have the same actual pitch classes in all these chords. And then again, same for if I start the chord on A or B double flat, I'd have A, C, A, C, E flat, G flat. So again, same notes, just reordered. So in other words, any diminished 7th chord is really 4 different diminished 7th chords at the same time, because all 4 of these diminished 7th chords share the same pitches. So we tend to hear the root of the chord as just being whatever note is the lowest in the voicing. So in this case, C is on the bottom, so it's going to sound like C diminished most likely. But we can use this idea to set up some really interesting deceptive resolutions. So like we could play this chord so that it sounds like C diminished 7, but then at the last second switch it so that it resolves as if it was, say, G flat diminished 7, or E flat diminished 7, or A diminished 7. So we'll talk about that in just a moment when we get to the deceptive resolutions, but that's it for the structure for now. Okay, so in the main video, I talked about the 3 standard resolution patterns for diminished 7th chords. Well, first of all, of course, these chords are very dissonant, very tense. They sound like they want to resolve. So that's typically how we use them. We use them as kind of chords to approach other chords. So use a diminished 7th chord and resolve it into something else that's more stable. It sounds very satisfying when you do that, this nice tension and release. The darkness kind of opening up to something brighter. Feels very satisfying. Okay, so the 3 common patterns of doing that are to have a diminished 7th chord resolve up a half step, so something like this. Sharp 1 diminished 7 going up a half step to 2 minor 7, for example. So that's C sharp diminished 7 going up a half step to D minor. Let's try to play that. It sounds like this. Or I could approach it with a major 7th chord, half step below the diminished 7th chord first. So 1, sharp 1, 2. So that's a very common pattern, just going up a half step into a diatonic chord. And then the other really common one is down a half step. I don't even really need to go through the book for this. I'll just play it for you. So here's going down a half step with a fully diminished 7th chord, resolving to a diatonic chord. So how about something like... So that was D minor, going down to D flat, diminished 7, and then finally down a half step again to C major 7. Now notice this is actually the same chord as the one I played in the ascending example. In the ascending example, I called it C sharp diminished 7. Here, when we're descending, I call it D flat diminished 7. That's just to kind of make the horizontal motion of the progression make sense on paper. If you're going down, that's flattening, that's pushing something down. When you're going up, that's sharpening, it's pushing it up. So we say sharp on the way up and flat on the way down. And then the last common resolution pattern for a diminished seventh chord is to resolve with 0 half-step root motion. So to resolve to another chord with the same root as the diminished seventh chord. So that's, like I said in the video, very common on the 1 and the 5 chords. So, for example, here's the 5 chord. That was 5-7, 5 diminished 7, and then back to 5-7. And I can just sustain that root note the whole time because they both have the same root, of course. And then I can do the same thing on the 1 chord. So 1 diminished 7, back to 1. And I can use that in a progression that uses both. For example, so those are called auxiliary diminished seventh chords. So again, they work mostly, and you find them most commonly on the 1 and the 5 chords, but you can feel free to experiment with these auxiliary setups anywhere. Just that, you know, some of them might sound weirder or less expected than others, but that's okay. Excuse me. So that's the recap from the video. Now let's continue on talking about new stuff. So the other thing I want to get into structurally about these chords is that they actually are related to secondary dominant chords sometimes. So when you have an ascending diminished seventh chord, that's actually almost the exact same notes as the secondary dominant chord with the same function. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let's go back to the book here. Okay, so this is my ascending diminished seventh chord going up a half step to resolve here. So the notes here, of course, are C sharp, E, G, B flat, C sharp diminished 7. Now, we're in the key of C here, so the 2 chord is going to be D minor 7. So a secondary dominant chord that also targets D minor 7, just like this C sharp diminished 7 is targeting D minor 7, would be just the dominant 7th chord, a perfect 5th above this chord. So that would be A7. So now what I'm saying is that A7 targets D minor 7 really nicely, and so does this C sharp diminished 7. And they both actually have almost the same notes in them. So A7 and C sharp diminished 7 are almost the same chord. So what I'm getting at is an ascending diminished 7th chord is really just a variation of a secondary dominant resolution. So let's look at A7. So A7 would be A, C sharp, E, G. So already very similar here, right? We have the C sharp in both chords. We have E in both chords. We have G in both chords. The only difference is instead of an A in this chord, we have a B flat. So here's B flat, here's A. That's the only difference. So we're actually just 1 half step away from being the exact same chord. Now, the thing is, it's actually very common to put a flat 9 on a dominant 7th chord. And that's exactly what B flat would be. If we put a B flat on top of this chord, that's just adding a flat 9th to a secondary dominant chord, which is very common. So that's really what this chord is. It's just like it's like an A7 flat 9 without the root. If you just kind of swap out a flat 9 instead of the root, you would get this chord. So in terms of sound and function, very, very similar. The main difference, of course, is that in this version of the gesture, you get a half step up root motion. In this version, you get this big perfect 5th down leaping motion. So it feels like more of a big jump rather than like a sharp push of the smaller half step motion. Let me play them both again for you. So here's A7 with a flat 9, resolving down a 5th to D minor 7. One more time. Now here's C sharp diminished 7. Very, very similar sounding to resolve to D minor 7. So one more time, I'll just play them both back to back. So A7 first and then C sharp diminished 7. Almost exactly the same sound. So that's important to realize when you're when you're using an ascending diminished seventh chord. It's basically the same thing as using a secondary dominant, just a slight variation there. But only for ascending diminished seventh chords. As it happens, if you look at the notes of a descending diminished seventh chord, so like if I was targeting D minor 7 with, say, E flat diminished 7, so now I'm going down a half step into D instead of up a half step into D. This chord actually has very little to do with this chord, the secondary dominant that also targets the same chord. They just don't really have that much in common. So it's only true of ascending diminished seventh chords that the secondary dominant chord that targets the same target as the diminished seventh chord will have almost the same notes. So kind of useful to know that. All right, moving on. I want to talk about chaining diminished seventh chords together. So in the video, I talked about just using a single diminished seventh chord to lead into a target place. Well, you can also just, what if you had, say, an ascending diminished seventh chord that went up a half step, and if that half step up, we find another diminished seventh chord. So it goes up a half step into another diminished seventh chord. And you can actually do that as many times as you want. And you can do that going up, going down, or really any direction, even staying on the same root. You could just, anyway, so here's, let's see, let's do C, C sharp, D, all diminished seventh. Oh wait, sorry. And then you could resolve up another half step from there, so. Or I could go the other direction. I could go, yeah, let's do that. Okay, so one more time. Here we go. So there's a bunch of descending diminished seventh chords chained together. So you can just do that. It does sound a bit weird, but it certainly works. So feel free to experiment with some outside of the box types of motions with these things. That actually brings us to our deceptive resolutions portion of this lesson. So again, we have the kind of standard resolution patterns that I mentioned in the video, but you can also kind of do whatever you want with these chords, especially if you use these cool little tricks. So let me show you some examples here. Okay, so here's a really common way of using unexpected resolutions of diminished seventh chords. So let's say we're in the key of C. We expect this C sharp diminished 7 to go up a half step to land on D minor 7, the diatonic chord a half step above. So we're expecting the C sharp to D motion. Well, what if we do C sharp to D, but with D as not the root of a chord? So we could go C sharp to D in the bass, but have that D be the fifth of this G7 chord, for example. So we're not landing on a D chord, we're landing on some other chord that has D as its inverted bass note, right? So you're just using inversions to set up kind of deceptive resolutions. It's gonna sound like the correct bass motion, of course, but this unexpected upper structure above the bass note is gonna be slightly surprising. So here's the expected resolution first. Oops, sorry. There we go, C sharp diminished 7. Going up to D minor. But instead we could do G7 with D in the bass, so I still get that sound. But it's not the one I expected. And now this also happens to be the same notes as G diminished 7 resolving to G7, which is an auxiliary diminished seventh chord. This is what I was getting at earlier when I said that because these diminished seventh chords are symmetrical, we can do all these sneaky things where we kind of, set it up to sound like C sharp diminished 7, but then it kind of turns into G diminished 7 before it resolves. So you can think of it that way, as kind of being two different diminished seventh chords at the same time, or you can just think of it as C sharp diminished 7 resolving to the right bass note, but the unexpected upper structure. Either way, it's going to sound slightly deceptive. So lots of different things you can do along that type of idea. Here's another example. You can play through these on your own if you want. I don't want to spend too much time going through all these, but feel free to get creative. That's the basic idea here. You can kind of do whatever you want with these chords, even if it's not the standard expected sound. It can sound really cool and interesting. Basically, these chords are so tense, so dissonant. Just if you resolve anywhere, it's going to sound better than, it's going to sound good. It's going to sound like some sort of sense of relief because it's so dissonant. Anything else that's not this dissonant is going to sound like a kind of resting place, relatively speaking. So it works. It sounds fine to resolve basically, however. And again, also because there are, 4 different diminished seventh chords within any diminished seventh chord, and any one of those could resolve up, down, or to the same root. That means essentially you can resolve anywhere. It's just that, again, the context will make some resolutions sound more surprising than others. Okay, lastly here, let's talk about melody. So let's be in the key of C again, and let me make another bar here. So here's C diminished 7, and let's see, how should I write this? Okay, let's just do it here. C, E flat, G flat, B double flat. Okay, so if we're in the key of C, for example, and we have this C diminished 7, well, if we're trying to figure out what notes to use in the melody on top of this chord, it's actually pretty simple. All we do is we use the 4 chord tones. So like, if I'm ever, say I'm playing in the key of C and I land on an E in my melody, well, I'm going to have to make that E flat instead of the diatonic E natural. Diatonic means the notes that are in the key, by the way. So I'm going to just kind of modify the notes however I need to make them fit the chord tones. I don't want any notes clashing with my chord tones. But that's only 4 of the notes. There are only 4 chord tones, but there are 7 notes in the scale, right? So for the other notes that aren't in the chord, we're just going to use diatonic versions of those. So what I mean is, for example, in the chord we have a C and an E flat. Well, just think about the alphabet. In between the notes, or the letters C and E, is the letter D, right? So in my chord I have a C and an E flat, but I'm missing a D. But in the scale I have a D, and specifically I have a D natural. We're in the key of C major here with no sharps or flats. So D natural is my diatonic version of D. If I was, say, in the key of E major, then I would have a diatonic D sharp, so I'd have to make that D sharp. So you get the idea. We're just using diatonic tensions here, diatonic non-chord tones. So I have a D in between my C and my E flat. In between my E flat and my G flat, I'd have an F, and again, that's going to be F natural because that's what's diatonic. And in between my G flat and my B double flat, I have an A, but A is the same note as B double flat, really. So I do have a G, though. In between G double flat and A, I'd have a G natural. That's also a diatonic note that's in between these 2 chord tones. And then here's the interesting thing. I also have between... So if I continued this and started, building the same chord again on my root here, I have an interval here now between B double flat and C. So again, B double flat is the same sounding note as A. It's enharmonic to A. So between A and C, I actually have a B natural in the key as well. So this is really interesting because this is going to sound like a tension. If I put this note on top of this chord, it's going to sound like a non-chord tone, this B, on top of the C diminished 7. But it's actually just a major 7th above the root, right? Here's C to B. That's just a major 7th. So this is a tension that is a major 7th. So this is called... So most people call this tension major 7. Which is a really interesting sound. You only really get this on diminished 7th chords for the most part, because you have to have a diminished 7th to make enough room to include an available tension above that 7th. So tension major 7 or tension 14 technically, because when we when we have notes that are functioning as tensions, we have to use compound intervals to describe them, and there'll be more on this in future video on tensions. So if this doesn't make complete sense for now, just stick with me for a little while and we'll cover it. So yeah, tension 14, tension major 7, it sounds like this. This high note here, tension 14. So it's a pretty interesting sound, and that's not the only note we can use on top of this chord that's not a chord tone. We have, again, these diatonic notes. We can use D, F, and G as well. So this would be the whole pool of notes we would consider for use on top of this chord. The 4 chord tones, plus all the diatonic notes that are in between the chord tones. So altogether, that creates some kind of weird scale. It's down here. So here's the whole scale of notes I could use. Oh, I'm sorry. Right, let me take that again. So all those notes do sound like they work on top of this chord. The only one that sounds a little bit crunchy is this one, G, because it's just a half step above the G flat in the chord. So that's a really dissonant interval. So this is what's called an avoid note. So even though the note is possible to use on top of this chord, avoid notes are notes that while you can use them, you want to only use them very briefly. So when you land on this G in the melody, you want to get off of it pretty quickly because it does have that strong demand for resolution. But then all these other notes like D, F, and B, they all are a whole step above the chord tone below them. So like C natural to D natural, that's a whole step. E flat to F, that's a whole step. B double flat or A natural to B, that's also a whole step. So these, you guys probably know the whole step is not as dissonant as the half step. Right, so it's just less tension. So these other notes that are not a minor second above the chord tone below them do not really demand an immediate resolution. They do sound like they want to resolve, but it's okay to not resolve them. It's not going to sound necessarily wrong if you just choose not to resolve them. So these are called available tensions. So basically the bottom line here is that for any diminished 7th chord, if you're trying to figure out which notes you can use on top of this chord, just use the 4 chord tones and then whatever diatonic notes are between the chord tones. And if those notes happen to make a minor second with the chord tone directly below them, like G does here against G flat, then that's called an avoid note, and you want to use those notes sparingly. All the other notes you can use as much as you want. So depending on what diminished 7th chord you're on, like where that chord falls in the key, you might get all sorts of different types of tensions here. Certain avoid notes will come up on certain chords, and then other chords might not have avoid notes or whatever. It just depends on the shape of the scale and where you happen to be in that shape. So I usually don't tell people to bother with trying to memorize the names of these scales that are created when you do this. Just think of it as, if I'm ever using a diminished 7th chord, I'm going to play the chord tones and I'm going to fill in the rest with diatonic notes. And whatever scale that turns out to be, so be it. It doesn't really matter what the scale is called as long as you know what the notes are. That's the important thing. The problem with thinking about the scales is that a lot of these are like really weird scales that it's just kind of more confusing than it's worth to try to think of them in terms of a scale. Just think of the actual notes that you have and just play those notes. That's kind of how I deal with it. And yeah, sometimes you get really interesting sounds like tension major 7 or even tension flat 13 as an available tension, which is kind of rare because we only get that on chords with a diminished 5th. You'll see all that stuff when you explore. So yeah, a lot of stuff here. Should be enough to keep you guys busy for quite a while. Please let me know in Discord if you have any questions, and good luck and have fun. Thanks a lot for watching.